So there's no current news or updates around Metroid or Metroid Prime 4. However, that doesn't ever stop me from constantly thinking about the game, wondering when we're going to see it, when we're going to play it, what console it's going to release on, all of that fun stuff that we are constantly discussing. And because of that, there is an idea, or I would say a guess, around what might be happening with Metroid Prime 4 that's been bouncing around in my head for quite a while, and I figured today would be a good reason for me to finally make a video, have this discussion with you guys, and kind of empty my head of the thoughts around this concept. And it has to do, of course, like I said, with Metroid Prime 4, and it has to do with the fact that the game is called Metroid Prime, the fact that Metroid Prime was an entity within the Metroid Prime trilogy. It's not just a cool, slick-sounding name for that series of games. The final boss to the original game is an entity called Metroid Prime. That entity, of course, then went on to spawn Dark Samus, and it created some of the coolest and most fantastic elements to the Metroid franchise, in my personal opinion. But with Metroid Prime 4 coming sometime in the future, it begs the question, after the conclusion of Metroid Prime 3, how can they call it Metroid Prime 4? And can you even make a game called Metroid Prime 4 without the entity known as Metroid Prime? So it goes without saying that it's going to be inevitable in this conversation for me to end up needing to probably spoil some of the events and bosses and characters from Metroid Primes 1, 2, and 3 in this video and in this discussion. So if you haven't played those games and you want to go in completely blind in a world where we get Metroid Primes 2 and 3 released on the Switch, for example, then you might want to be aware of that before hearing me talk about this anymore. Or if you just don't even really care because you're willing to play Metroid Prime 4 no matter what happened in Metroid Primes 1, 2, and 3, then that's also fine, and I encourage you to continue watching the video. Also, my subscriber experiment in the last video totally freaking worked. I went 6 months without asking you guys to subscribe to the channel at the beginning of the video, and subscriber growth died. I did it in my last video just as an experiment, and I got a bunch of subscribers. So hey, I'm just going to remind you, if you like what I'm doing, you like Nintendo video games and Metroid, then subscribe to the channel. Alright, so let's get into this. Can you make Metroid Prime 4, and can you call it Metroid Prime 4, without the existence of Metroid Prime? To me, it becomes very tricky, and I remember back when the game was first announced and revealed back in E3 of 2017, which we all know was over 6 years ago, and we don't know anything about the game since that time. But I remembered not only being, inconsolably excited about the announcement of Metroid Prime 4, but also a little bit confused, because this is where the spoilers are going to start. Essentially, as far as we know it, Metroid Prime, and really Dark Samus, who is the essence of Metroid Prime after being defeated at the end of Prime 1, is defeated, and as far as we've ever been told, completely dead and gone by the end of Metroid Prime 3. In my opinion, part of the brilliance of the entire Metroid Prime trilogy was how they found a way to make 3 games where the overall essence of what was Metroid Prime still existed as a threat. Metroid Prime was just a big, monstrous Metroid creature at the end of Metroid Prime, creating my all-time favorite final boss fight. At the end of that fight, where you fight 2 forms of Metroid Prime, one using the larger, spider-like exoskeleton form, and then the actual Metroid Prime core essence form, which is this ethereal, floating blob Metroid thing that Metroid Prime ultimately is. You defeat both forms of that, the game ends, but then you realize, because Samus has to use her Phazon suit standing in a pool of Phazon to fire it at the Metroid Prime core essence entity. Once that fight is defeated, it turns out that this combination of Samus's DNA, the Phazon essence of the Phazon suit, and then of course the defeating of Metroid Prime creates this sort of fused Dark Samus entity, and her hand reaches out of this pool of Phazon, and it turns out that in defeating the Metroid Prime core essence at the end of Prime 1, Samus accidentally created this Phazon-infused Dark Samus doppelganger entity. And then, of course, that carried on in Metroid Primes 2 and 3, where Dark Samus was the main overarching antagonist and threat of those 2 games, so that across all 3 main Metroid Prime games, you have Metroid Prime and also Dark Samus, which are all different versions of the same general Phazon-infused entity that is the actual threat and the bosses to all 3 games. And at the end of Metroid Prime 3, Dark Samus, who is again also technically Metroid Prime, merges with the Aurora 313 unit. You defeat the Aurora 313 unit, and for all intents and purposes, and as far as the lore has ever told us, that is the end of Dark Samus, which means it is the end of Metroid Prime. And so to me, that's where things get really fascinating and interesting, a little bit confusing, but honestly, still exciting. At least to me, as a huge Metroid fan. Because suddenly we realize, well, Metroid Prime and Dark Samus apparently died back in 2007 when Metroid Prime 3 came out. But here comes a new Metroid Prime game. It's Metroid Prime 4. Maybe the title changes. We know we don't have an official title. Maybe they decide not to call it Metroid Prime 4. Maybe they call it Metroid Prime 4 : something. It's almost for sure going to have a subtitle, just like Prime 2 is called Echoes and Prime 3 is called Corruption. But at the end of the day, if the game ultimately sticks to the title of Metroid Prime 4, Metroid Prime anything, I would say, I feel like you almost have to have the essence of Phazon and or Dark Samus / Metroid Prime as a part of the story. You know, and you could do that in a couple of ways. You could make it that the creation of Metroid Prime and Dark Samus and then the ultimate defeating of that entity, maybe it was true and Dark Samus and Metroid Prime was defeated, but is there some lingering element where maybe some other entity, whether it's the Space Pirates or a different entity, has decided to pick up the work that the Space Pirates did to have created Metroid Prime, and they create a new version? So maybe there's no Dark Samus, but maybe a second Metroid Prime entity is created, or it was maybe the foundation of the blueprint to creating some other entity that might not actually be Metroid Prime, but maybe it was based off of the Space Pirates experiments that itself created Metroid Prime, right? So it gets very confusing, and hopefully it makes sense when I explain it that way, but the long and the short of it is, I struggle to find a world where Nintendo decides to make a Metroid Prime 4 game and call it Metroid Prime, but not include the overarching story and essence of Metroid Prime the entity in that game. Now, over the years on my channel, I've heard many times from fans explain that they feel like the title of Metroid Prime across all of the Metroid Prime games, with the exception of Metroid Prime Pinball, is more of Nintendo's nomenclature for first-person Metroid games. And I can understand why someone would think that. And to be fair, it's not even technically wrong. You know, Metroid Prime Pinball, again, notwithstanding, it's not wrong because every other game called Metroid Prime, which is the 3 Prime games, it's Prime Hunters, and it's Prime Federation Force, those 5 games are all first-person games. So some folks have pushed back saying, well, if it's Metroid Prime, all they're trying to tell us is that it's going to be first-person, not that it has anything to do with the story, the lore, or the Metroid Prime entity. And honestly, I don't agree with that. Now, maybe Nintendo proves me wrong, and they change things up, and Metroid Prime 4 comes out, and it has zero to do with Metroid Prime the entity and with Dark Samus. If they do that, it will shock me. It would honestly kind of disappoint me, but it would show me that Nintendo has decided that Metroid Prime really just means first person, and it doesn't have anything to do with the story. But if I'm being honest with you guys, as a Metroid superfan, here and now, before we know anything concrete about Metroid Prime 4, I don't think that's the case. I believe the name of Metroid Prime, any game called Metroid Prime, has to do with Phazon and Metroid Prime the entity, and probably Dark Samus. I just believe the lore and the history of the series says Metroid Prime only refers to those story elements. And so obviously it's up to Nintendo and Retro Studios and the folks responsible for writing the story and the lore and the events of Metroid Prime 4 to determine what they want to do. Could they go in a weird direction and decide that they don't need Metroid Prime in a game called Metroid Prime 4? Yes, it is technically within their power to do whatever they want. But like I was just saying, it just comes down to the fact that I don't believe that that's the intent. I believe, and I also hope, that the reason the game is called Metroid Prime 4, if that becomes the final title of the game, is because they have found, hopefully, a very clever way to write a Metroid Prime 4 story that includes or resurrects the idea of Metroid Prime the entity, and I would even love it if they found a way to bring back Dark Samus. Is it going to be kind of convoluted, and would they maybe force it, you know, Would they even, you could say, retcon? I feel people misuse the word retcon, so I don't really think that it would be retconning, but just to make it simple. Would they retcon, in a sense, the events of Metroid Prime 3 to say, whoop, we lied to you, it turns out Dark Samus and Metroid Prime wasn't defeated, they're back, and that's why we have a Metroid Prime 4. I kind of want them to do that. I want Metroid Prime and or Dark Samus to be in this game, because Metroid Prime is my favorite game of all time. Primes 2 and 3, also two of my all-time favorite games. And the fact that we're getting a game called Metroid Prime 4 just gives me goosebumps. It is so exciting. And I want to believe that they have a good reason for making a Metroid Prime 4. Not just for nostalgia, but hopefully they just have a good story to tell that makes sense and that justifies its existence as not just another random Metroid game, which would also be great, but it's also specifically a continuation following the events of Metroid Prime 3. Now, I've discussed in the past how I feel like they could jump around in the timeline and set Metroid Prime 4 way in the future, maybe even after the events of Metroid Dread. So that could also influence some of where they go with the story. But even if they do that, it's still going to be called Metroid Prime 4, so it should still have Metroid Prime in the game. In fact, another element that's relevant to this conversation, and I do eventually plan on making a video focused more specifically on just this topic, but to briefly touch on it here in this conversation, it is worth noting that there is a great chance Sylux is going to be heavily featured in Metroid Prime 4, because at the end of Prime 3, it turns out that Sylux is following Samus. Samus flies away after defeating Dark Samus and beating the game, and it's over. But then you see Sylux's ship, and he flies after Samus, and then the game ends. Very much hinting that Sylux is a future threat that Samus will have to deal with sometime down the road. So, yeah, more than likely Sylux is part of this game. Now, I've long said, if Sylux is a part of this game, I could see Sylux filling a similar role in Metroid Prime 4 that Dark Samus did in Metroid Primes 2 and 3. And if that's the case, does that remove the need for Dark Samus to be in the game? Could Sylux fill that role? I think so, but what if Sylux is filling that role, but behind Sylux, he doesn't actually turn out to be the main threat? He's almost more a pawn of a larger Metroid Prime entity, or a Dark Samus entity, or some other Phazon-infused or Phazon-powered creature, or ultimate final boss, if that makes sense. So that it seems like Sylux will be the final boss, but it turns out that it's something else, and that itself could have to do with Metroid Prime. Obviously, these are just all my personal opinions and theories, fan theories about what could be happening. It's worth noting, I feel like I have a pretty good track record when it comes to fan theories. I predicted years ago that the concept of Metroid Dread wasn't dead and would come back eventually. And I even was able to predict the ultimate twist and final reveal that happened in Metroid Dread, you know, way before the game actually released. Obviously, it was announced, but many months before the game came out in October 2021, I predicted that as well. So that doesn't mean I'm right. I'm not trying to say that, but when I analyze the events, the story, the history, the lore of the Metroid franchise, and I do my best to try to understand where I think they might take certain parts of the story and of the franchise, I mean, I feel like I've had a pretty good read on what Nintendo's intent with the franchise and the character has been. And so I just hope that that stays true for Prime 4, which means I hope that they have a good way, not a forced way, but a good way to reintroduce Metroid Prime and or Dark Samus into Prime 4. I would be a little disappointed if those entities aren't a part of the game, but that doesn't mean the game would be bad, so I'm still going to be excited no matter what they're doing, if that makes sense. So this is what I think. Tell me if it makes sense to you guys. These are my thoughts and predictions, and who knows when we'll find out the real answers, but this is what I think may happen. So that's about it.